Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our ninth diverse webinar. Things are a little bit different today in that Madeline and I are in person together. So this is a different process, but it's great to have her here with me.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you for joining us all today. Before we begin, we invite you to take a moment to reflect on the Indigenous peoples and lands you are on today. Madeline and I are, and this Zoom link, are based out of the University of Alberta here. So I'm going to do our land acknowledgement for where we are right now in Edmonton. The University of Alberta, its buildings, labs, and research stations are primarily located on the territory of the Nahia, Niitsitapi, Métis, Nakota, Dene, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe lands that are known as part of Treaties 6, 7, and 8 and homeland of the Métis. The University of Alberta respects the sovereignty, lands, histories, languages, knowledge systems, and cultures of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Cynthia Franklin from the Canadian Forest Service, who will introduce our webinar for today.
Great, thank you. So this webinar presents work on invasive alien pests carried out at the Canadian Forest Service's Great Lakes Forestry Centre in Sault Ste. Marie. This work contributes to the assessment of the vulnerability of Canadian forests to climate change, as well as Theme 1 of the Diverse Initiative. Invasive pests are the first global stressor for which this assessment has been completed. Today's session is a joint webinar bringing together two networks, Diverse and the Forestry Adaptation Network, reflecting shared priorities and complementary work. Links in the chat provide more information about both networks and how to stay connected. A quick note on housekeeping, please feel free to post your questions in the chat at any time. We'll address them during the panel discussion at the end of the session. And now I'll pass it over to Madeline to introduce the presenters.
Yay, thank you. So today we'll have Isabelle Aubin, who's a research scientist in forest ecology at the Great Lakes Forestry Centre, where she studies forest responses to human-mediated disturbances such as pests and climate change. She's the leader of this joint webinar, so thank you, Isabelle, for organizing this. We have Chris McCurry, who's an entomologist. He studies the risk and impacts of invasive species on Canada's forest and a focus on hemlock woolly adelgid and the emerald ash borer. We'll then have Amanda Rowe, who explores the ecophysiology and evolutionary history of forest insects and uses this knowledge to inform and understand the risks they pose to Canada in the face of global change. And we'll finish with Anna Tervelin, who focuses on invasion science, particularly on the cold tolerance of invasive insects such as the spotted lanternfly and the cascading effects and synergies between biological invasions and natural hazards. So Isabelle, I'll let you start and we'll have a discussion later.
Merci, Madeleine. So you see my slide now, all good like that? So I can start. So thanks everybody to joining us today. In this webinar, we'll explore one of the key drivers of global change, the invasive alien pests, which pose a significant threat to the resilience and long-term sustainability of our forest. Predicting their impact is far from simple. When the insect is introduced, it's difficult to anticipate how they will behave outside their native range, how severe their outbreaks may be. And while many introduced insects may never become invasive, others can make severe outbreaks and target even hosts that we never expected. So all these uncertainties, with also the stochasticity of their introduction, make it difficult to take them into account into the day-to-day forest management. So today we decided to have this webinar to give you both an overview of the threat posed by these pests and also giving you some closer look to some key insect of concerns. So invasive alien pests, what we are referring here today is it's insect introduced outside their native range with potential of causing ecological and or economic harm. Overseas transport is a main invasion pathways with many invasive insects that can come here introduced hidden in wood packaging material, for instance. This is far from a new issue. Since the European settlement, it had been estimated that about 450 non-native insect species have been established themselves on North American trees. with about 14% of them that cause substantial damage. Now we have stricter phytosanitary regulation, which really help reduce the risk of new introductions. But the increase in global trade means that we are rolling the dice over and over again, so that additional pest invasion are highly likely to occur. And apart from the overseas introduction, we have also alien insects that can invade Canadian forests across the Canada-US border. And this trend is likely to intensify with climate change. In Canada, historically, we had these extreme cold temperatures that have really served as a natural barriers that limited the establishment and the spread of the invasive insects. As the winter warms with climate change, we can expect an increase of northward range expansion. There is, for example, some species that were originally introduced to the United States from overseas and that are now expanding their distribution northward. Chris will speak about the hemlock woolly adelgid, le puceron lanigère de la pruche. There is also species that are from North America, but that are now able to move beyond their historical ranges. They can now invade new regions with the climate change and colonize new host species. And I will in the case of the mountain pine beetle, le dendroton du pin. So these invasions happen while our forests are experiencing increased drought events. We have also extreme weather and important changes in the growing condition of our forests with climate change. So all these increase the tree susceptibility to the insect damage. Also, climate change is also influencing a lot the insect biology, for instance, developmental rates, reproduction, to name a few of the impact it could have on insect biology. Climate change also affects tree-pest interactions. For instance, it can disrupt the timing between the tree phenology and pest activity. And it can also cause changes in tree defensive secondary metabolites, among other things. Because of their short life cycle, the mobility of the pest, their reproductive potential, their physiological sensitivity to temperature, even some modest change in climate will have rapid impact on the distribution and abundance of these insect and pathogen. So the focus here is really on alien pests, on the insect, but this also apply, of course, to native pests, which also can undergo important changes in behavior and outbreak severity with climate change. So it's not only the alien one, also the native one are going into these changes. So Canadian forests are really a complex mosaic of tree species and potential pests with significant regional variation. It really makes harder to have a complete portrait of the vulnerability of our forests. From a management perspective, it is therefore useful to adopt a community-level view of these pests, one that considers the potential cumulative impact of several pests in using, this is useful for setting, for instance, the priorities, both in insect surveillance, but also in forest management strategies. So today, that's why we'll start with this webinar by sharing an overview of the threat in the form of an integrated assessment that we recently developed at the Canadian Forest Service. Following this, we will present in more detail some pests of particular concern. I will start by presenting on emerald ash borer, la grille du frêne. Then Chris will present on the risk that pose an emergent threat, the hemlock woolly adelgid, le puceron lanigère de la pruche. Anna will present then on the mountain pine beetle, le dendroton du pin, and its synergies with climate change. And Amanda will then present on the Asian longhorn beetle, le longicorne asiatique, and on the key role we can play on pest early detection. And at the end of all that, we hope to have a plenary session to discuss with you, answer questions, and discuss the implication of all these invasions on forest management. So let's start with this national assessment. But first, I would like to present the team who worked on this project, all from Great Lake Forestry Center in Sault Ste. Marie. So our aim with this assessment was to obtain a comprehensive national perspective of all these alien species coming, all the emergent threats. So we started this project by conducting a national scale scan to identify potential threats. We identify a total of 75 invasive alien insects of concern for Canadian forests. Then from this work, we narrow down the list to a short list of 14 high-risk alien insects. To be included, the insect had to be currently present in Canada and have the potential of causing... Oh, Catherine?
That was my bad. Ignore that. Continue.
Oh, sorry. No, that's fine. Yeah. So, okay, good. So yeah, these insects had to be present in Canada and have the potential to cause significant forestry mortality over the next 20 years. So collectively, these 14 pests have the potential of affecting 65% of the most abundant forestry species in Canada. This includes pests with high severity that are causing extensive mortality. They are circled in this slide here in pink or violet. And at the end range of the severity index, there is also some pests that we have included that will mainly affect mostly stress or weakened trees. They are circled in blue here. So we combine the distribution of these 14 high-risk insects with the distribution of the 37 most abundant tree species in Canadian forests. To do so, we integrated several layers of information in our analysis. We had the stand composition, the insect distribution, and climate scenario to determine the insect climatic niche, and also an index rating of the severity of the infestation. With this information, we were able to produce these maps, which shows the forest stand biomass at risk of being exposed to these alien pests. It's very an integrated assessment, all the insects included in one map. So with this approach, we estimated at more than 13 billion tons of tree biomass potentially at risk in Canada in the next decades. This represents about roughly half of the forest tree biomass in Canada. I'm saying potentially at risk because it's important to note that here we're not modeling the actual dispersal of the insects, but our assessment is really showing the climatic suitability of the insect and the presence of the tree host. That's why we say potentially at risk. These maps include two types of information. There is the potential of tree exposition on the x-axis. If you look the legend, I think you can see my, I'm not sure you're seeing my, no, I don't think you can see my arrow. But on the x-axis, you have the tree exposition, and the y-axis is the severity of the infestation. So on the map, when you have green, a region is indicated in green. This means we have a relatively low tree biomass that is exposed. In contrast, when you have purple to pink, it highlights region of particular concern where we may expect high mortality rates, which means a lot of trees are at risk under a severe outbreak conditions. And in blue, high tree biomass exposed, but the damage of the pest that is there is projected to be relatively low severity. And gray areas represent either non-forested areas or forest stands that we do not include that do not include any exposure to any of our focal invasive pests. So on these maps, we're able to see two major hotspots. They are in pink color. So there is the North Central British Columbia, and there is the St. Lawrence Seaway Corridor near the US border in the east. So these hotspots represent forested regions that may require closer surveillance and management to mitigate potential impact. The vulnerability in these two hotspots is fundamentally different. In the west, the vulnerability is driven by few key pests, most notably the mountain pine beetle that Anna will speak later in the webinar. On the east coast, the vulnerability arises from several insects simultaneously threatening companion species within the same stands. This includes the ash, American beech, eastern hemlock. Individually, each of these three species represent a relatively modest amount of biomass exposed, but outbreaks from different of these pests are severe with extensive mortality. And an important impact that it's important to take into account, important impact of these pests is a reduction of the functional redundancy within tree communities. So we are now, with all these severe outbreaks happening, we are seeing a shrinking pool of viable native replacement tree species. It's also interesting to see how contrasting the boreal forest is, which is, you can see it's in green or gray on the map. It's really reflecting relatively low exposure with only a small number of invasive insect species of low damage severity. So far, we can say that the boreal forest can be considered as a cold spot in comparison with temperate forest. It's also interesting to look at this integrated assessment in terms of the number of invasive insects. There again, we can really see important regional contrasts with Eastern Canada being a hotspot in terms of number of invasive insects. So what is left non-affected by these pests? That was really a question I was having in mind. I remember many years ago chatting with Taylor about all these invasive insects coming in Canada. So from our list of the 23 most abundant tree species growing in Eastern Canada, we still have maples, poplars, cedar, and basswood that are not affected by any of our 14 high-risk insects. But of course, these three doesn't mean they are non-affected by any pest, because they are affected by pests, both native and non-native, but none that are causing extensive mortality. However, Amanda will present another insect, a 15 Asian longhorn beetle. This is a special case. I will let Amanda present it, but if this beetle established in Canada, we estimate that an additional 3 billion tons of tree biomass could become at risk in the coming decades. And the establishment of Asian longhorn beetle in Canada would further reduce the functional diversity of eastern forest, because it is affecting the maple, the poplar, the willow, many species. So on our list of the most abundant tree species in Canada, if we have this Asian longhorn beetle arriving, only white cedar and basswood would remain free of the major non-native pest threats. So pest invasion threatens our forests in several ways across the country. Many questions, how to intervene, which pest to monitor, regulate, eradicate, where. All this is important decision that has to be made at the onset of the infestation with very limited information. And during the plenary session, Taylor can provide plenty of example of some of these hard decisions that have been taken in the past and that needs to be taken in currently or in the future. And also accurate, timely information on tree pest dynamics. It's really important that it's also rapidly provided to guide forest management. So really a good communication between the insect world and the forest management world, as different pest-tree interaction can lead to very different outcomes. And the communication goes both ways. Amanda will demonstrate in her talk how forest manager can also play an important role in early detection of these pests. So I will leave this slide. It's open for now, because I hope we have a chance in the plenary session to discuss more and at the light of this talk, but also the presentation given by my colleagues. So from there, I will start right away a short talk on the emerald ash borer after two decades in Canada. Yes, because it has now been 23 years since this insect, emerald ash borer, La Grille du Frêne, was first detected in Ontario. And since then, this small insect have spread rapidly across the country, often hitchhiking on infested firewood. It was a good way for propagation for that insect. And this beetle is causing extensive mortality in all Canadian tree species, and it's very devastating. At CFS, we began monitoring its impact in 2010. Our first monitoring plots were established in the southern Ontario at the epicenter of the infestation. And we installed plots in other regions as the insect was spreading northward. So in the following slides, I will present results from our long-term monitoring 2 decades after the arrival of this insect in Canada. But first, the theme over the year. So we have monitored more than 1,000 mature white and green ash trees in our 46 sites across 4 regions in Ontario. And all these trees died within 10 years of initial detection of the insect on the site. So us in on our site, we were not able to identify any resistant ash, so we had a 100% mortality on our site. What this means for forest: in hardwood woodlots with a high diversity of tree species, ash mortality typically creates small canopy openings that are rapidly filled by other tree species. So just it could, in some cases, just have a minimal impact on the forest canopy. But in contrast, in less diversified forests, ash mortality can result in the loss of substantial part of the forest canopy. This is an example here. This is an urban woodlot in Ottawa. This was a pure ash stand, mostly pure ash stands that had little tree regeneration because the understory was heavily invaded by buckthorn. And after the outbreak and the removal of the dead ash and of the buckthorn, the site was back to an open field. The picture you can see here, you see one tree. It looks like one tree, but in fact it's a dead ash that the forest manager there kept for us, so we know where was the center of our plot. But overall, ash is an ineffective colonizer, and 6 to 10 years after complete mortality, when we were doing the monitoring, we were still observing high regeneration stem densities in a large number of our sites. So a key unresolved question for us was really the fate of this regenerating cohort. These young stems represent the foundation for potential ash stand recovery. However, it remains uncertain whether this regeneration will ultimately be killed by emerald borer, or if some individual will be able to survive long enough to reach a reproductive size and contribute to seed production. So in our site, we found only a small proportion of the regenerating stems reaching the minimum reproductive size for ash, which is above 8 centimeters of DBH. And 10 years after ash canopy mortality, we could not find any stem greater than 15 DBH in our sites. So we decided to examine in more detail the infestation rates in ash regenerating stems and really to reconstruct the timeline of infestation in each of our sites to really understand these relationship between the emerald ash borer and these regenerating stems. Because emerald ash borer, what we could see in our result, really have a strong preference for larger trees. Yes, it can attack small stem at near 3 centimeter size, diameter, but small stems are infested only when there's nothing else to eat. They prefer the larger trees. Here, the infestation rate we found was very varying between size and region. Here, what you're showing here is in these graphs, it's the yellow box represents marks really the year in which a regenerating stems was infested. I'm showing here timelines graph for 10 sites from 2 urban regions. There's the Oakville and Ottawa. And the higher number of yellow boxes in one of the sites means there's a greater infestation rate. On average, across all our sites, we had 42% of our stems, of originating stems, that were infested at least once, with 28% in Oakville, whereas in Ottawa, there were only 6% of the stem were infested. So this lower infestation rate observed in Ottawa was very interesting. Infestation in Ottawa was characterized by a rapid mortality of the mature ash trees. It was really at the same time than a drought, so the tree died very rapidly. And the city had been quite fast at removing the dead trees for removing the hazard for the people. And this may have contributed to a rapid decline of emerald ash borer population because it's really quickly depleting the available host resources at the time when the regeneration cohort, the small stems, were still too small to sustain the local EAB population. But these low infestation rates observed in Ottawa may also be linked to other factors, such a reduced fertility of the insect in colder climates, as this is the most northern region we have monitored so far for green and white ash. So there are several factors at play here that we still have to follow to get a full, complete understanding of the story here. So after 15 years of monitoring, we start to have a better understanding of the complex trophic relationships now emerging between this pest and ash regeneration after the initial invasion. And we really see that the size at which the insect hit the regeneration will be decisive If the young ash stems can survive long enough to reproduce, there is some hope for natural adaptation. But if not, the ash may still rely on its vigorous resprouting ability to maintain a presence in the landscape. But in both scenarios, the likelihood remain very high that ash will lose its functional role in our forest ecosystems. On a good note, the introduction of parasitoid wasps may play an important role to reduce the emerald ash borer pressure on regenerating stems. We found parasitoid wasps infesting emerald ash borer larvae in 6 of our sites, although none of our sites was a release site. So it's very interesting. And these infestation was representing 16% of the 2022 infestation. So representing a substantial impact of the wasp on the EAB the emerald ash borer larvae. And also, as the insect move north, just a quick note to say that we are currently establishing monitoring plots at ash stands, and we are lucky to be able to do this work in collaboration with a group of geneticists, restoration practitioners, and indigenous knowledge holders. And we work together toward a better understanding of black ash dynamics, and we're also exploring restoration strategies for this culturally and ecologically important species. I will leave this for now, and hoping we can discuss more in the plenary session at the light of presentation given by my colleague. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Isabelle, for the setup. So I'm going to talk a little bit about hemlock woolly adelgid and the risk to Canada. And I will attempt the name in French one and only time. It's Le Puceron Lanigère de la Pruche. And so that's the hemlock woolly adelgid. I might call it HWA as we go through the talk, just because we tend to use the shorthand, because as you can tell, it's a pretty long name. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to sort of do a very basic talk about the adelgid, because it's kind of a new pest for Canada. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is kind of what is the hemlock woolly adelgid. So hemlock woolly adelgid is an insect that feeds on eastern hemlock trees. And its closest relative that most people would be familiar with are aphids. If you have roses, aphids are a common pest of roses, and they do very similar damage. And what the insect does is it sticks its mouth into hemlock trees and feeds on the plant juices, which ultimately weakens and kills the tree. Unlike aphids, these insects are only mobile for like a very brief part of their life. And once they find a spot to settle in, they won't move for the rest of their life. And so that's what we're showing here on the left side. That's viewed down a microscope tube showing the hemlock woolly adelgid nymphs and the young first or second instars starting to settle and feed at the base of a hemlock needle. And so what they do to protect themselves, since they're never going to move again, is they make this woolly outer coating that protects them. And so that's what I'm showing there on the right. And that figure shows a heavily infested hemlock branch, and each of those little puffs looks like a Q-tip, is one insect. And on a heavily infested branch like this one, on heavily infested trees, all the branches can look like this. So these are millions and billions of insects on a single tree. And so what happens when these insects attack is you get tree mortality in 3 to 6 years, maybe a little bit slower in Canada. It attacks Eastern and Carolina hemlock. We don't have Carolina hemlock in Canada. And what the feeding does is it disrupts the flow of that nutrient to the needles and disrupts photosynthetic activity. So you get death of the needles, death of branches, and ultimately death of the tree. It also has an incredibly complex life cycle, and I promised Isabelle that I wouldn't have a life cycle, but for this one, you don't actually need to know anything about this. But what I'd emphasize, there's two messages. It's the combination of this insect has a very small size, very complex life cycle, means it's very challenging to manage. That's because it's very hard to see. It's very easy to move around, and the populations grow very quickly when the conditions are right. In part because the insect is asexual, so it doesn't need to mate to reproduce, so you can establish a population with just one insect. And so it's a challenging insect to manage. So how did it get here? How did it get to Canada? It was introduced to the U.S. state of Virginia sometime prior to the early 1950s probably came on infested plants for planting, so horticulture stock that was brought into gardens. It's the strain we have is from Japan, and it's been slowly moving northwards with beginning in kind of the 1950s, with sort of rapid expansion beginning in the 1990s, and that's kind of what this figure from this paper here shows. And it's up in Upper New York State in the early 2000s, and then we detected in Nova Scotia in 2017, and in Southern Ontario in 2012, and then a little bit later on. What constrained hemlock woolly delge's northern spread, what we think it was the occurrence of cold temperatures. Then what that can do is can knock back populations, and these factors were important. Are so important that hemlock woolly delge wasn't actually predicted to expand to Canada until sometime in the early 2030s, and that's just based on predictions on ecoclimatic models based on what it was doing in the States and where it was living. In reality, it's been found here since 2012, and from the state of some of the infestations, certainly Nova Scotia and Southern Ontario, it's probably been here now, probably between 15 and 20 years, so quite some time. So how does it move? Expansion is mostly driven by birds and wind, and other vertebrates moving populations. And this is just why I emphasized the life cycle earlier. So the timing of one of the mobile stages of the insect, what we call the crawler stage, coincides with spring bird migration. So kind of like right around now and in the next couple of weeks. So what happens is as birds transit through infested stands in the Northeast US and the central US there, it can pick up this crawler stage on the birds and then move them northwards. So that movement is really hard to detect and it's really hard to prevent. And then once those insects are established in stands, they can get moved around by the wind. And since it reproduces asexually, a population can start with as few as one individual. So you can get one insect landed off one bird, establishes a population, and then you're kind of off to the races. So this is the state of the infestation in in Canada right now. So we have two populations, one in Southern Ontario, which is the one I'm more familiar with, and I'll talk a little bit about that for the rest of my time. And then the much larger infestation in Southern Nova Scotia, that's been going since 2017, and it's been spreading through that area and really affecting hemlock. There's also a native population of hemlock woolly delge on Canada's west coast that I won't talk about too much, but it's a native insect there. So what's the risk to Canada? So I'm going to jump back to this slide for just a moment and focus on that area in green, and that shows the range of eastern hemlock in Canada. And what we'll see there is that eastern hemlock occurs throughout Southern Ontario, Southern Quebec, and then through the Maritime provinces. So especially in Southern Ontario and Southern Quebec, that hemlock often exists as high-value remnant stands, either in ecologically sensitive areas like, say, along the Niagara Escarpment or in conservation areas. And in Southern Nova Scotia and parts of Central Ontario, hemlock is often indicative of old growth and mature stands that may not have been disturbed for hundreds of years, or if ever been disturbed. So these are high-value stands. We can characterize the risk a bit more if we just focus in on Ontario. So we know, the abundance of hemlock is already much reduced because of land conversion, but it's also important to sort of forest and timber species in Central Ontario. The species is similarly important in Nova Scotia, where we know it has significant cultural value to Mi'kmaq people. And the result is that you have both a significant ecological, social, and economic values are all at risk from loss of hemlock because of HWA. And in the US, mortality from the delge has resulted in stand conversion, with hemlock often failing to regenerate because of the delge or things like deer browsing or competition from other species. What happens in Canada is a little bit unknown. That's one of the things that folks are still working on, but there's the potential exists for a significant mortality of hemlock and the potential local loss or extirpation of hemlock in some of these areas. So it's a significant risk. So some of the work we've been trying to do is to characterize that risk. And so we worked with a student at the University of Toronto who had built a species distribution model for the adelgid, and we merged that with a hemlock occurrence model that a colleague at the University of Guelph put together, and that QR code will take you to it, and you can actually search for different hemlock stands in Ontario. And what Cameron did when he put these two things together was to come up with a risk matrix for Southern Ontario for hemlock. And what we see, so this set of maps sort of merges this climatic suitability and the abundance of hemlock in Southern Ontario. And what we see that kind of under a business as usual climate strategy on the right, all of Ontario is at risk from hemlock woolly delgid under future climate. So that's pretty significant. We don't have maps for Nova Scotia and Quebec because we just focused on Ontario for this project, but we'd sort of expect something similar because Ontario is at kind of the climatic limit for of the adelgid. And so what we see here is probably reasonable to predict would occur elsewhere in Canada. So that's kind of my very quick summary of the adelgid. There's a resource we put together in Ontario for all of our information about the hemlock woolly adelgid, and it's hosted by our friends at the Invasive Species Center. And that QR code will take you there. You can get access to all of our publications and a management guide, a bunch of other stuff we put together on the adelgid. So I think that's me, Catherine. I'll tap out, and somebody else can take the stage.
Okay, so that's me now. I'm Anna Turbelin, and I will be talking to you about the synergies between mountain pine beetle and climate change. So, mountain pine beetle, ou le Dédroctone du pin ponderosa, is a phleophagous wood-boring insect native to Western North America. Mature adults are brown to black and 5 to 7 millimeters long, so that's about the length of a grain of rice. They have a 1 year life cycle. Chris, you made me laugh because I had the life cycle slides that I removed from this presentation. Sometimes it's a 2 year life for the mountain pine beetle, and they spend the majority of it under the bark of a tree. Now, like I said, it's native to North America. It's mostly found throughout the range of its host. On the west coast of North America, it ranges from northern Mexico to northern British Columbia. And like Isabel said, despite being native to Canada, in the last 15 to 20 years, beetles have breached the geoclimatic barriers of the northern Rocky Mountains and invaded hybrid lodgepole jackpine stands that are contiguous with the transcontinental boreal jackpine forest. You can see those on the red. Actually, I think I'm placing the point up. There we go. You can see these on the red on this map. So that's going into Alberta, from BC to Alberta. Now, the mountain pine beetle attacks a wide range of pine trees, including the ponderosa pine, hence the name, western white pine, jack pine, whitebark pine. But it mostly affects the large diameter mature lodgepole pines. In general, they prefer to attack larger mature trees that are more than 80 years old. Now, to understand the synergies between mountain pine beetle and climate change, it's important to understand their population dynamics and interactions with host trees. In theory, the process is quite simple. The adult lands on the tree, they bore into the phloem, introduce fungi, they copulate, they excavate galleries, lay their eggs, and so on. And then the young adults emerge, go on to another tree. However, this is not a one-way system, and trees are not passive. They respond to the attack by exuding resins, which provide a physical barrier and toxin, and they also do autonecrosis, which confines the beetle and the fungi. Nearly all of the trees respond, but there is intraspecific variation in the rate and extent of the response. So to overcome this, because it's really a matter of the beetle versus the tree, one of them will die. The mountain pine beetle either avoid resistant trees or they do pheromone-mediated mass attacks, which is quite cool, really, when you look at the process. And they aggregate onto trees. So they enter the tree, aggregate, and whether they succeed in establishing is dependent on the density and rate of the attack and the tree defense response. Then if they beat the tree, they are able to reproduce, and this can lead to a stand mesoscale invasion. Now, all these steps are influenced by local beetle density, weather, physiological stress on host, as well as competitors and predators, which are attracted actually by the resin and the volatiles released by the tree and pheromones as well. So to shift to a landscape scale eruption or regime shift is dependent on the supply of optimal host trees, the rate of depletion of the sap, the tree, the availability of hosts, and also if there is a high connectivity in the landscape. For an outbreak to be successful, sort of say, the beetles need to reach certain threshold at each of the steps that you see on the slides, and they're generally governed by internal controls, either from the beetle, so behavior physiology, density, attack rate, the microbial symbionts, dispersal, but also on the host sides, like host defense chemistry, canopy density, resin flow, phloem thickness, and so on. Now, these internal controls are themselves dependent on external controls. So there you have drought, biotic stresses on the host, temperature, succession, disturbance, geophysical barriers, and so on. So it's quite a complex relationship, really, between the tree and the mountain pine beetle that then leads on to outbreaks. And this obviously can all be influenced by climate change, whether it's changes in temperature regimes, increased temperature, changes in precipitation regime, or changes in extreme events like drought, fire, floods, but also our response to climate change, like management practices or when we're aiming to reduce CO2 emissions. For example, if we look at disturbance, when we think about the synergies, we can think of drought. So drought weakens the tree defense systems, and which makes it more susceptible to mountain pine beetle attacks, but it also incites outbreaks by providing a pool of severely stressed trees. And then to this, you can add fire. Now, fire can compound the effect of mountain pine beetle or tree mortality by directly killing trees or damaging trees and making them more appealing to the beetles. Here you can see a dashed line that's to represent management. So in this case, fire suppression can alter the fire return interval, which can result in an increase of homogeneous forest cover. And as you can remember from the previous slides, this is quite important to move on from a local outbreak, let's say, to a more landscape scale outbreak. It's not just a one-way relationship, hence synergies. Drought can also increase fuel flammability and tree recovery. Beetles can increase the risk of high severity fires by providing coarser ground fuels. And now to this, we can add the effects of climate change, which can increase the drought severity, increase outbreak, and also fire frequency. Again, this is not just a one-way system. Actually, beetle outbreaks can reduce forests' carbon uptake and increase emissions from the decay of the trees. And when you look at all these interactions, actually, this is just one example of the synergies that can take place, but there is more complexity. Other synergies to consider, which may be beneficial or detrimental to the beetles, are like extreme cold events that would just kill them. So like we've seen cold winters in Alberta between 2018 and 2020, they've contributed to the collapse of the population. And also increased precipitation, which would improve resin flow and therefore improve the defense of the tree. So why do we care? Well, mountain pine beetle are integral agents of ecosystem function, but they're also major sources of economic loss, challenges to natural resource policy. They cause widespread tree mortality. Like I said, it's the beetle or the tree, change in forest structure, composition, and function. And despite the fact that outbreaks are infrequent, temporary, and generally followed by a collapse to low densities, the number of epidemics has increased and expanded into persistent infestation in habitats that had only rarely been affected. So with this, understanding synergies can really improve our ability to manage continually changing natural systems. And on that note, I would like to thank you and say merci for listening to my presentation, and I will pass on to Amanda.
And so to wrap up, I just wanted to give an example of how we can approach and address invasives and have a successful sort of outcome with some of these with an invasion story. Okay, so Isabel did an excellent job of sort of showing the impact that an invasion can have on our forests, both natural and urban forest canopies. And this is really clearly demonstrated with the emerald ash borer invasion. And when invasions arrive, we have a very limited window of opportunity where we can respond in a way that leads to either prevent or eradicate an invasion. And any tool that we have that can help us to target that early response window is going to be highly advantageous to any approach, to any management approach. And with that, we, my colleagues and I, wanted to look at what role passive surveillance may have in how we respond to forest invasives. And this is just an example of a number of different forest invasives where a passive surveillance approach was actually really critical to the early detection of new infestations. And when I talk about surveillance, surveillance really exists along a spectrum from active to passive. And when we think about an active surveillance program, these are programs that are species specific, they're directed, and they're often led by trained professionals. Whereas as you move along that spectrum, you enter into surveillance that may be non-directed or even coincidental observations. And these tend to be, people tend to be involved that are less educated on invasives or are not part of their day-to-day job. And this was really well demonstrated in the invasion stories of Asian longhorn beetle. So Asian longhorn beetle, or Anoplophora cleberpennis, it's a large wood-boring insect, quite stunning. It's a very attractive insect, and its main hosts are hardwood trees, particularly things like maple or poplar. And that preference of maple really poses a threat to the maple syrup industry. Because of how they feed in trees and they feed in that sort of core of the wood, they are transported in infested wood products or in logs. And that transportation has led to multiple infestations in North America. And this is just this is the series or timeline of infestations that were detected in North America. And this is on top of the additional infestations that had occurred in Europe. And what I want to draw your attention to is the number of blue boxes on the left-hand side of the timeline. These actually represent detections that were traced back to a member of the general public who notified a professional, whether the regulatory agency or a private industry that knew what to look for, and they were in fact the ones that had detected Asian longhorn beetle initially, allowing a response to occur and leading to an eradication. And so I just want to highlight a little bit more detail looking at the Canadian infestation. So the initial infestation was detected in 2003 in the Toronto Vaughan area. And it was because an employee had discovered a beetle, a large attractive beetle, on their vehicle at work. They gave the specimen to their supervisor, who then brought the insect home because they had a child who was interested in insects and was putting together a school project. When they sat down to identify what insect this was, they were led to online resources that have been developed by the USDA, and they recognized this very attractive beetle as potentially being an Asian longhorn beetle. And once they realized what it might be, they reported it to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, who is our national regulatory body, and that triggered an initial response. Because the response that is typical for the Asian longhorn beetle is an eradication. This led to a mobilization of a large number of resources for many organizations that came together to lead or to develop an eradication plan and implement an eradication of the population in Southern Ontario. So tree removals and surveys were conducted from 2003 to 2013, and then in April of 2013, that Asian longhorn beetle infestation was declared eradicated. However, 6 months later, it was discovered again. Again, an employee discovered a beetle on their vehicle at work. Because there were still communication tools like billboards up in the Greater Toronto area, this employee recognized what they had in hand and reported it to the CFIA. This then triggered another round of eradication. And this second round of eradication lasted for a number of years and resulted in a number of tree removals as well. So what I want you to take from this is the role that the general public has played in allowing trained professionals to respond rapidly and quickly to infestations, because if you can get to those infestations when they're small, the likelihood of success at successfully eradicating or managing those populations is very high. The success of eradication decreases rapidly as that infestation establishes growth. And communication and that public involvement was critical in that detection. And the tools that were still up and available for the public to see really were the reason why they responded by reporting their observations to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and allowing the professionals to respond. So all told, there were over 700 trees removed in those Southern Ontario sites. Over 15 years of surveillance have been conducted. But all of that investment meant that in 2020, we were able to declare Canada Asian longhorn beetle free. So we were successfully able to eradicate this Asian longhorn beetle population. This did require a significant amount of investment. But if we hadn't done that, there is a significant amount of forest that is at risk. So if you look at the bottom map, this is the area that could be infested by Asian longhorn beetle because it is a very cold tolerant insect, and there are a wide range of trees throughout Canada that it is capable of feeding on. And so if we look at the map that Isabel had showed, so on the left, this is the forest biomass that's at risk with all of the high-risk invasives that we included within our study. We purposely did not include Asian longhorn beetle. If you do include Asian longhorn beetle, this increases the amount of biomass that's at risk to Asian longhorn beetle infestation up by 3.1 billion tons. And you can see much of that is concentrated in Eastern Canada, which is where the vast majority of the maple biomass exists. And so all of that investment in eradication has protected those components of our forest from Asian longhorn beetle. One of the interesting changes in society that has occurred since 2003, when ALB was initially discovered, is the development and the popularization of biodiversity monitoring tools. And a really good example of that is iNaturalist. And so iNaturalist are these online observation platforms that allow the public to take pictures of their observations out in nature and share them with a global community. Now, what this allows is it allows us to concentrate observations in one place and allows professionals then to scan these observations for potential invasives. And so this means that a curious member of the public doesn't actually need to know what is an invasive. They just need to take a picture of a cool bug. And we can use lots of additional tools that can help us to identify these unusual sightings as being potential invasives. And in fact, what we're finding is that the observation we saw with the ALB infestation and the detections are echoed through many of our invasion stories in forest species globally, and that the public or this general surveillance tends to be much more effective at detecting those initial or early infestations rather than species specific or directed surveillance. And so what does this all mean? And it really means one of the best tools that we have at our fingertips is an engaged, curious public. And so encouraging members of the public to explore their own backyard really it creates an early detection system. And sharing those observations allows professionals to monitor and rapidly respond when new things are observed. And using a common shared platform such as iNaturalist allows an aggregation of observations rather than trying to scan through multiple new tools or platforms. And so ultimately, encouraging curiosity, encouraging people to be outside and make observations of the world around them and to spend time in the forest looking at the trees, looking at the bugs, looking at the plants are going to be our best tool to respond and identify these new invasives. And so with that, I will leave it there and send it back to Isabel.
Hi, well, thank you very much, Isabel. I don't know if you want to close this section before we move on to the panel.
I think we can just move on. I was already moving on, so.
Excellent. Before we jump to questions and the discussion, I would like to introduce one more panelist, Taylor Scarr. So Taylor Scarr is the director of the Integrated Pest Management Division at the Great Lakes Forestry Center in Sault Ste. Marie. And he oversees research on forest pests, brings his experience across science, policy, and management. And we're glad to have him part of this panel to point to the practitioner aspects of the work. If you have any questions, we would like to invite you to put them in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll be able to allow you to talk on the webinar. And to start the panel, I would love to hear your thoughts, Taylor, on what was just presented, and maybe how does that translate on the ground?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, those are all very excellent presentations, and I think you can see that the threat is across the country, is from coast to coast, and some of the forests are some resilience and some don't, and as one of the points that Isabel was making was that there are very few species that we have that aren't affected by potentially affected by invasive species, and there's some really good research going on to address those concerns and figure out what the biology is. And sometimes when you get these new species, we don't know much about them at all. And emerald ash borer is a prime example of that, where we just don't know enough to know what the thing is going to do, how it's going to spread, what the hosts are going to be, what the impacts are. There's a significant investment, as Amanda described, in just dealing with these new species and what we're going to do about them. There is enough work here for all of us to do this kind of work. And that's, Amanda's talk about the citizen science and bringing people in to help with the detection, monitoring, and response programs are critical to this. There's a place for all of us to play in this, in the education and the outreach and in the management and in the diligence to making sure that we don't bring these species in. We are particularly at risk because, as was described with the the threats of overseas species coming in through global trade, through sometimes fraud, sometimes things are shipped with infested material. And even though we have processes in place in Canada and the US to stop that or slow that down, it's not perfect. And these things are still going to keep coming in. That being said, it's not all doom and gloom. There are things we can do. And as Amanda described, the successful eradication of Asian longhorn beetle, one of the few successes that we have at actual eradication. And then, as described for hemlock and for ash, there are some management techniques that we can do to reduce the impact overall and learn to adjust our management and how to work within the forest ecosystems to ameliorate the damage and potential threat by these insects.
Thank you. So without further ado, I think we can start taking the questions from the audience. We have some questions as backups, but I think engaging with people who are here would be best.
And we already have one question in the chat, so I'll go ahead and read this out. This is from Pierre Bertrand. How many decades are the coming decades that have been talked about throughout the presentations? What is the timeline used for these prediction models? So I don't know who wants to take that. Maybe Isabel, you can start.
Yeah, maybe that's yeah. We did the what we were presenting in the overall in the integrated assessment. It's for 20 years, so till 2040. That was just we really wanted to see in the near future.
Perfect. Thanks, Isabel. We have one hand up. So Nicoletta, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question. If you want to put your camera on, you're welcome to do that as well. Oh, maybe Nicoletta isn't with us.
I invite the other panelists maybe just to open their camera so we can.
Yes, please.
And that would be good, if you don't mind. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna move on to our next question. I think maybe Nicoletta's having some tech issues. One moment, please. Okay, we have one question, our Q&A from Francine McDonald. Isabel, do you know what the cues are for EAB's preference for mature trees?
Sorry, you said, what are the
cues? What are the cues for emerald ash borer's preference for mature trees?
Yeah, I can give an answer, and I may send it to Taylor as well, and Chris. What we really see, it's a question of the bark. You know, the texture. That it seems that at a certain size, when the texture of the bark is just a good for the insect. But I may leave it to Taylor because you were explaining that to me recently, so I think you will have a better explanation to me and Chris as well about the size of what you see similar things with the branches in the trees. So I will leave to the specialists on those questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Isabel, and hi, Francine. Thanks for your question. Yeah, so what we found over the years with this insect is it really does like diameter of about 8 to 10 centimeters. It seems to be where it likes to go, whether it's a vertical stem or it's a branch in the tree. That seems to be what it's like. And as Isabel said, part of it's related to the bark thickness and the texture of the bark and how easy it is for it to lay its eggs. And then for the larvae, once they hatch, to burrow in. And also the ratio of cambium to the diameter of the tree. So there's, in a healthy, vigorous growing portion of a tree like that, there's lots of cambium in which it can feed. So it's a primary food source for it. When it's a little smaller than that, it almost, tunnels its way around and gets in its own tunnel because there's just not enough space for it to go around the tree. So because as you know, it does like to zigzag on the tree, and if it's a much smaller diameter, it's hard for it to do. It just becomes a vertical tunnel. But by zigzagging and trying to cut off the defenses of the tree by feeding that way, then it can feed the tree much more successfully. And I know, Chris, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, to understand EAB, it helps to understand where it came from. So it's in its native range, it's a specialist on dead and dying parts of dead and dying trees. So in reality, it can attack just about anything, any size of ash tree. Our ash trees can't defend themselves, and so everything looks like a dead and dying ash tree to an EAB. We know that some it does better in some species than other. It tends to do really well in black ash, tends to do really well in green ash, maybe a little bit less well in white ash, but cues and that kind of thing, it doesn't really amount to much functional difference in what the insect does in the landscape.
Okay, thanks guys. We're getting lots of questions, so this is awesome to see so much engagement. Our next question comes from Charles Knock. Is the Asian longhorn beetle less cold tolerant than the mountain pine beetle? I'm wondering if cold temperatures in the boreal are expected to limit the potential for the Asian longhorn beetle to spread in boreal forests.
That's a really good question. Now, they're not entirely comparable because how Asian longhorn beetle handles cold is a bit different than how mountain pine beetle handles cold. And there were actually established populations of Asian longhorn beetle in Finland, and so that's quite far north. The big difference between mountain pine beetle and Asian longhorn beetle is that mountain pine beetle can complete a life cycle in 1 year, even in the boreal forest, whereas as Asian longhorn beetle moves further north, it requires multiple years to reach maturity. And so the development time and the rate that the population will grow gets much slower as you move further north. And so while winter temperatures may not be a full climatic barrier, the temperatures of the growing season will slow the population growth down, which does slow the spread of any potential invasion and provides sort of more time to respond with an eradication. So that's kind of the temperature limit that may exist for that invasive.
Thanks, Amanda. Okay, we have a few more coming in the Q&A and the chat, so I'm keeping track of a few things here. We have from Shelley Wang, who is one of our diverse students, for Isabel. Based on the National Pest Scan, were most of the pests generalists with large overlaps in their hosts, i.e., do many vulnerable trees share pests? What are the potentials for mitigation through diversification of trees against generalist pests?
Oh, I would need to. Is it in the? Can I read it somewhere, or can you
Yeah,
just
if you
repeat
go to
the answer?
the Q&A on the bottom, you should
Okay.
be able to read it yourself too to help reference it.
Q&A. I see the chat, but I don't have the Q&A. Oh yeah, I got it. Okay, yeah. Oh, okay. Okay, sorry, because there was many things into this question. I think I don't know if anyone had an answer while I'm reading it, but
I can start.
good. Thanks.
What
Thanks,
I-
Amanda.
Yeah, what I would say is many of the pests may attack or infest trees within the same genus, and that's where, for example, the emerald ash borer is a good example. So it feeds on different kinds of fraxinus, so different types of ash. There are extremes, and say Asian longhorn beetle is a good example of an extreme where it feeds broadly on hardwood trees, and so we're talking trees across multiple genera. I think any diversification provides protection, and we see that in our urban canopies, and we have seen what's happened when only one tree is planted. So when elm was the primary urban forest tree that was planted, and then Dutch elm disease came through, we lost all the elms. So then we just replanted with a whole bunch of ash. And then the emerald ash borer has come through and we lost all of our ash. And so if you look at urban forests, diversification does provide protection against invasives because it does give you some buffer for any one thing, because it's hard to predict what's going to come next. And that, I think, is the biggest challenge.
Yeah,
I just emphasize it's certainly it's a strategy for urban forest, for managed forests. It's not really a strategy for native forests. There's a limit on the things that will grow in Canada, and as you move further north, the number of tree species that can live drop out. So there's a reason that tree tree species diversity in the boreal is pretty low. It's because that's all that lives there. That's all that can live there. And as you move further north in Canada, and certainly as you get into Western Canada, your options for trees fall away. So diversification only works like in Southern Ontario, Southern Quebec. Your toolbox gets really tiny as you move into the rest of the country.
And one thing maybe I can add on this is that it's interesting that currently it's really our more diversified forest that is more hit in terms of the numbers of pests. It's really the richness of invasive of concern are really in our temperate forest. And I remember an interesting chat we had, Taylor, about the fact that the boreal forest is kind of having less species, but is kind of already having some is used to this kind of level of disturbance, is currently have native pests, is used, so it was kind of the niche was filled. You were saying, I may leave you the floor there. I don't know if Taylor where I'm going, but it was interesting to think that in this case, it's our less diversified forest, that it's a cold spot, and our highest diversified forest is where it's more hit right now. But I'll leave you the mic from there, Taylor.
Well, that's very good. Thank you for the setup. Yeah, it's for the boreal forest, we look at that as very much a disturbance-oriented ecosystem to begin with. So you have species that tend to dominate there that are programmed, if I can use that word, to respond to disturbance. So whether it's balsam fir or aspen or birch, even jack pine, lodgepole pine after fire, those kinds of major disturbances. So those tree species are programmed to respond to that. So it actually makes it a bit more resilient to invasion by invasive species, whether it's plants or insects or diseases, in the sense that those trees are already programmed to do that, much like our invasive species that are coming in. They have the same kind of ability to invade and take advantage of disturbance. And emerald ash borer is a prime example where, the ash trees in southern Quebec and Ontario, they're growing in areas that really couldn't be farmed because the sites were wet and it was already disturbed. There wasn't a complete ecosystem there, but those trees, that system didn't have much resilience because all that was planted there was basically ash, and that's what was because of the ground was wet. But as you move further north, those trees are much more. Their boreal forest is much more resilient to those kinds of invasions. We think that's what we see so far.
Taylor, maybe I remember you because we're speaking about insect that has invasive insect that's having impact, but you were telling me the story about the Syrinx noctilio that
Yes.
You were at the beginning thinking you may have a higher impact, but finally is lower than we were expecting. So maybe we can tell this story. If you want to add a few words on that, it might be a good example here.
Sure. So Syrinx noctilio is a European wood wasp that is a significant pest in the southern hemisphere, where it's invaded pine plantations. So there were no pines native to the southern hemisphere, and where they've been planted in places like Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, South Africa, those trees have been they've been attacked, and there's been some mortality, and in particular where the stands are not managed. When that insect first was found in North America, 2004, in the U.S., 2005 in Canada. There was concern it was going to invade and become a serious pest like it had been outside of its range in the southern hemisphere. But that turned out not to be the case. The risk assessments showed that, and the actual data showed that it was trying to occupy a niche that was already occupied. The trees have their own native Syrinx species that they co-evolved with to give them resistance to that kind of attack in that niche. And then there was already European pine shoot beetle present here. There was already Ips pinei, the pine bark beetle, bark engraver, that were trying to occupy the same niche. And so the trees had some resistance. And then most of those insects carry fungi with them that are help the beetles or the insects to get established in the tree and weaken the defenses and act as a food source in some cases. And the fungi that the different species were carrying turned out to be not any more aggressive than the other person's fungi. So basically, whoever got to the table first got to eat. And so their fungi weren't able to battle each other and claim the space. Whoever got there first just got to live there. Basically, there was some partitioning in the bole of the tree. Some insects want the higher part of the tree and some want the lower part. But overall, they're all competing for the same resource. So our native ecosystem had some resilience to that insect. And except for the original invasion wave where there was some mortality, it's Cyrex noctilio, the European wood wasp, is not really a serious pest in North America.
Can just add that it's bring the interesting thing that we're here in a trophic relationship, eh? So sometimes it's the diversity of the tree species we're looking, but sometimes we should look to shift and look to the diversity of pests that the host have, or the fungi, or the biological control, or it's all. So we're really in a trophic relationship here, if I can add.
Yeah.
I hope it's responding the question she had.
Thank you, guys. Just gonna keep moving. We have so many great questions. From Dave May here. How are the risk assessments being integrated into policy and regulatory frameworks? I'll let whoever wants to take a stab at that go forward.
Maybe we should ask Taylor on that one again, eh?
Yes. Well, I know all the people here deal with risk assessments, and that's the interesting part of their research is it does feed into it. So Amanda's work on cold tolerance is primary for risk assessments, and one of the first questions we get when we get a new species is what's its suitability? What's the suitability of our climate to this new insect or disease? And Amanda set up her lab to be one of the first places you go to for that kind of research, whether it's hemlock woolly delgid or pine beetle or spotted lanternfly and so on. And Chris's work as well as in the biology feeds into the risk assessments, and Anna's work on the multi-hazard risk that she talked about is also part of the risk assessment. So the way it works is that the risk assessments are done to determine what's the probability of introduction, what's the probability of establishment. In other words, the thing gets here and stays here, is able to reproduce. What's the probability of spread, and what's the probability of impact? And so all that research that is being done that we've talked about, including the work that Isabel's doing on impact work, it all feeds into the risk assessments. And the way it works at the national level, the federal level in Canada, is those are led by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And one of the best things they've got with their risk assessments is they're independent of the policy. So the risk assessors do the assessment and say, what's the probability of all those things that I talked about? And they come up with a numerical score, but as much as important, they come up with a narrative that says, what do we think is going to happen with this new species? What's the risk of these things happening? And that then goes to the policy people who say, now we know what the science says. What does the policy say? Is it feasible to do something with this insect? Or disease? Is it important enough from a political or from a societal point of view to do something with this pest, from an economic point of view, from an ecosystem point of view? So that then becomes the policy decision. And Cyrex is a good example of that. There was discussion when that insect first arrived. Do we need to regulate this insect? Do we need to put controls in? There were meetings with industry. There was meeting with growers associations, with horticulture, with forestry sector. And at the meanwhile, the science was going on around it. And the science came back and said, we don't think this is a serious risk for Canada. We don't think it's going to be a significant impact. Those risks are relatively low. And so there was a policy reversal. When they were concerned at one point, and then they said, we don't think we need to be concerned. Different situation with Asian longhorn beetle, where as Amanda described, with the threat to the maple syrup industry and so on, a very significant impact. And as Isabel's slide showed, could spread across the maple range and the hardwood range in Canada. So a risk assessment said this is a very serious pest and drastic action needs to be taken. And that was the policy. And then that was formulated into an operation where there was an aggressive eradication program carried out. So they're science-based, but they're not. The risk assessment is science-based. The policy decision takes that into consideration, and as well as many of the other things. I know Francine's on the call here, but Ontario has a similar situation where the risk assessment is done in order to regulate a pest under the Ontario Invasive Species Act. For a species to be regulated, there has to be a risk assessment done first to show that the science says there's a serious threat here, and if so, then the species gets regulated after that. So I hope that answers the question. And anybody else involved in risk assessment can add anything that I may have overlooked or correct anything.
Great. Yeah, really interesting. Thanks, Taylor. Okay, we have another question in the chat here from Matthew Duvenek. I'm wondering if there are examples where invasive forest pest stories in Canada have increased or expected to increase forest tree species diversity, e.g., for example, invasives releasing less dominant species that might do well under climate change.
I've been looking at that question, trying to think of an example. And I can't think of one, but it starts from the assumption that increasing diversity is always a good thing. Like, for instance, when emerald ash borer took out ash stands, mature ash stands, and Isabel showed that in her talk. What comes in underneath that is buckthorn and a bunch of other garbage. So species diversity has gone up, probably, but it's not what's supposed to be there. So I can't think of a good example. I mean, pests are part of forest succession in Canada. So like mountain pine beetle is native ranges. It's supposed to be there. It's supposed to do what it's doing, and it causes the forest composition to turn over. Invasive pests, it's like a reset button. You don't know what's going to happen afterwards, and you can't really predict. So
Yeah, we
Yeah,
have more example of an invasive that is increasing the abundance of other invasive. Can be on different traffic level or invasive plants, or it's more toward that. But I was reading also and trying to think. Maybe later it will come, but nothing coming to my mind. I think
yeah,
Anna, you wanted to add something. Sorry.
basically the same as what Chris said. I couldn't think of an example. In general, it's what was described when invasive take down a tree, they open up the canopy and like you get shrubs and herbaceous, and you don't really increase tree diversity as such. What works the other way though is that's the case for spotted lanternfly. Sometimes the pest follows the tree. And in the US, there's the tree of heaven that's invasive and is the main host for spotted lanternfly. So that's like a relationship that's the other way around. But I couldn't think of increased tree diversity either.
Thanks for the answers, guys. Okay, I have to be picky here now because we're running out of time slowly but surely. One more in the Q&A here. One through line here has been the importance of citizen science, and more specifically, the interest and involvement of youth. Does the panel have any suggestions how we can better leverage youth, so from kindergarten to grade 12, involvement during this diverse project's timeline?
So I'm not involved in the diverse project. However, I've thought about this, and I actually sort of responded to a similar question in the Q&A to Francine. But what it comes down to is we need people who are interested in being in their natural world, and we hear about the sort of the nature deficit and the lack of people out engaging with the world. Now, probably we're preaching to the choir here. People that are here listening to these types of talks are the people that are already out in nature and are probably taking your kids on forced nature hikes and showing them everything that they don't really want to know, but at least getting them to be aware of the world around them. I think there's a couple of different ways you can approach this. So engaging with organizations that are like knowledge brokers or communication specialists. So the Invasive Species Center is a really good example. They do a fantastic job of sharing knowledge and engaging with the public in a way that is much more flexible than what sort of federal agencies are capable of doing. As scientists, I think it's in our responsibility to share our science and share what we know and share enthusiasm with the public, and through that interest and engagement try to foster just a general interest in the world around you. So that can be volunteering your time with anything that is engaging with the public and outreach. So even bio blitzes are great. The local natural history clubs, supporting those people with your time and with your knowledge are really important. And communicating the work that you do is critical. I don't think there's any one thing that is going to be a silver bullet there, but I think it's very multifaceted.
I'd add to that stickers, Amanda. We need stickers out there. And I say that jokingly, but Amanda and I have been working on some outreach stuff and stickers on water bottles. And one of our challenges is keeping up with the ways of there you go. Keeping up with the ways of connecting with youth and Amanda through the Insect Production Quarantine Lab here is producing stickers for water bottles and those kinds of things. But we have to get materials out there. Social media is another way to do those kinds of things. And it's a two-edged sword, as everybody knows, or multiple-edged sword, if there's such a thing. And things like iNaturalist and places like that, where people might be going to learn. There's Facebook. There are other kind of groups that Insects and Arachnids of Ontario and places like that I'm more familiar with, that we need to make a conscious effort to reach out to and make sure the right information is there so that it's not being filled. If we're not putting the right information out there, that void will be filled by somebody else, and it may or may not be correct information. And as Amanda said, I'd reinforce that the knowledge brokers like the Invasive Species Center are excellent at doing that. The government we don't respond to that well. We have so many rules and so many requirements, and it takes a while to get things approved that we find it much more effective to work through partners and doing that kind of engagement.
Add something more generally as well is that communication, a lot of the time by the time we're communicating about a new invasive, we should, like the question I receive about a lot of the time asking, we have, how should I treat my ash trees? I speak with people from cities saying, we're currently trying to see how we will manage the emerald ash borer. I'm just like, yes, but now look to the next invasive. We always kind of one insect late, I would say. So I think it's important to focus on what's the next one coming in, and the communication should go toward that. But that said, we still need to do a long-term survey of the impact, but it's kind of a different level. I would say the communication needs to be at different level, and I think it's important, like for now, to really know that we have to look for the Asian longhorn beetle. We should look for the spotted lanternfly. We should put for hemlock woolly haldelgid. We should look to those one, and the emerald ash borer. We should look on how we can manage the after outbreak. But it's not. Yeah, we're not. This is done. For now, it's just how we manage the impact. But we need to check what's coming on and what are where we could have a success. Of managing the insect that is arriving now. So sorry, I may not be clear, but yeah, that's what I would. So communication should be sometimes targeted more to what's coming up than looking back. Mm-hmm.
I will just say, following on from that, is the really nice thing with those observation platforms like iNaturalist is the general public actually doesn't need to know what the new thing is. They just need to see something interesting and share it. That's actually the power of those platforms, because it allows them to serve as our eyes in the field, whereas the professionals then can use all sorts of tools to scan those observations. So we're not actually having to flip through the pictures ourselves, but we know what might be coming next and find things that are outliers, that are in places they shouldn't be. And that will speed along that response and detection system. And so that's where the strength of just being outside and curious and sharing what you see is really powerful.
Okay, thanks so much, you guys. We're just at 12:30, well, Mountain Time. I know it's later for you guys, but we're just at the end of our time, and so I just want to be considerate of that for our guests. But thank you everyone for presenting and everyone for coming with us. This is our highest turnout I think we've ever had for a diverse webinar. So that's really awesome to see. I'll just touch on some logistics before passing it over to Madeline. But if you missed some of the presentation or you want to share this with people that didn't get to see it in person or like in real time, keep your eye out for our YouTube channel. We do post the recordings on there after we have received them from our IT department. So just keep a lookout for that. And yeah, share it with whoever you want to. But yeah, really appreciate seeing you all here. I'll let Madeline take it from there.
Well, I just want to thank you, Isabel, for bringing this and leading this initiative of a joint webinar. We really appreciate it. I want to thank you, Cynthia. I don't know if you're still there, for organizing this on your side of the forestry network. I don't know if you have any last thoughts on your side to share. Great. Thank you everyone for joining, and we hope to have another joint webinar eventually.
Yep. Yeah, and stay posted. Or keep posted. We'll keep you posted about our next webinar that'll come up. We try and do them every other month, but we'll see where the next one is. But we'll be in touch with our entire email list. So